As we've seen, brutalism, like the Baroque, like High Victorian modern Gothic, has been routinely vilified. 50 years after its heyday, however, its uncompromising vigour and muscular aggression are once again beginning to be appreciated. It begins with Le Corbusier's audaciously violent reaction to the smooth white idiom of which he was the master in the 1920s and 30s. Doesn't it? Le Corbusier was the 20th century's greatest architect. He had no doubt about it. Nor did his numberless idolaters, who refer to him as Corb, an embarrassing intimation of familiarity rather akin to that of people who call Miles Davis Miles and Buckminster Fuller Bucky. No less embarrassing, though, than Le Corbusier's own habit of referring to himself in the third person, a habit today associable with brain-ectomized footballers and backward celebrities. One might take a cue from André Gide. When asked who was the greatest French writer, he replied, Victor Hugo. Alas. Le Corbusier. Alas. He had all the usual qualities of a big-time architect: paranoia, vanity, startling selfishness, egotism, resentment, sycophancy, moral nullity. Like Talleyrand and the Vicar of Bray, he had the ability to switch sides with impunity. After 2 years' anilingual treating with Pétain's Vichy government, he even went to live in that benighted spa, he attached himself to de Gaulle's Minister of Reconstruction within days of the liberation of Paris. As a writer, he was a harmful eccentric, rash, provocative, and a dangerous influence on those same idolaters who took his megalomania seriously. His most famous dictum, "A house is a machine to live in," was stolen from H.G. Wells's Tono Bungay. As a painter and sculptor, he stole from Fernand Léger. Le Corbusier, painter and sculptor, began to coalesce with Le Corbusier, architect. And they begat the architect that he would be for the last 30 years of his life. The pre-war master of white, abstracted, orthogonal villas for the rich and arty mutated into a primitivist, a pseudo-primitivist, working, supposedly, for the people. A stylistic Talleyrand too, then. His architecture took on the farouche colours, irrationalism, emotional heat, and dreamlike exaggerations which he displayed in the other disciplines. His sculpture became architecture. His architecture became sculpture, functioning sculpture, sculpture with a social purpose. It was an extraordinary mutation. It was as momentous as what the wife of a current government minister called the shifting of Teutonic plates. He had, so to speak, abandoned the prose of a technical manual in favour of the poetry of the sublime. The precocious Edmund Burke, Anglican, aesthetician, politician, no passion so effectually robs the mind of all its powers of acting and reasoning as terror. And whatever is terrible with regard to sight is sublime. In which case, these are sublime: the might of mountains, yardangs, the seething ocean, basalt columns and pounding waterfalls, jackfruit trees and sausage trees, the force of the screaming wind, canyons and hoodoos, termitaries, forces beyond human control. The witness to the sublime is overwhelmed by vastness, by awe, by wonder, by terror. The sublime is crushing. According to Burke, the sublime's qualities include ruggedness, lack of clarity, infinity, and also darkness, literal darkness, the darkness of heathen temples. Unlike his older contemporary David Hume, Burke believed the sublime to be dissociate from the beautiful. The two qualities were mutually exclusive. Burke found the sublime in certain poetry, Milton's, but not in painting, at least not in the painting of the mid-18th century. This was before Turner, before Caspar David Friedrich, before John Martin, whose every waking day was a molten apocalypse. But paintings which attempt to capture the sublime are not themselves sublime. Maybe any form of representation precludes sensations of sublimity. Succession and uniformity of parts, which constitute the artificial infinite, give the effect of sublimity in architecture. Greatness of dimension is also requisite. Again, Burke was writing of the architecture, the classical architecture of his time. Times change. Mankind usurped God. Mankind has, to put it mildly, augmented the inventory of the sublime, not through pictorial or literary representation, not by making art about it, but by matching it. By mimicking nature, by emulating the elements, by acting like camoufleurs, by learning from plovers which are indistinguishable from the stones they lie on. Sublimity and terror are found in technological warfare, listening devices, choreographed mass rallies, the explosion of atomic bombs, cloud seeding, the multiplication of means by which the atrocious can be achieved. They are found in pylons, great dams, oil refineries, power stations, bridges, cooling towers, chimneys whose smoke colours the sky, orange, apple, plum. They are found in the brutality of cold warriors, whispering mutually assured destruction through chinks in the Iron Curtain, which stretched from the Barents Sea to the Black Sea. A 4,000-mile-long, 40-metre-high blind barrier of plates, rivets, braces, bolts, studs, chevaux de frise and rust. The structures of over half a century ago, architectural monuments, supreme feats of engineering, represent the dramatic apogee of the high Anthropocene era, when mankind guiltlessly lorded it over the earth with disregard for the consequences or in ignorance of the consequences or with the conviction that the means are always justified or with the blindest of eyes. Much of this seemingly monolithic gigantism might form the mise-en-scène of myth, seemingly because whilst the majority of brutalist works are built on a superhuman scale and belong to an extra-human realm, they're fragmented, articulated, punctuated. They evoke powers which, until science caught up, were the properties of nature. And nature, throughout most of mankind's term on this planet, has been determined by God, or by gods, or devils, or furies, or spirits, Bacchus and John Barleycorn, Odin and Eros, Apollo and Saturn. These were the agents deemed responsible. These structures challenge the gods. They're monuments to mankind's supremacy. They're supremely optimistic, supremely confident, supremely hubristic. Mankind, when it was discovered that there was no God, saw an opportunity. There was a void to be filled, and to be filled with ostentatious earnest and grandiose exaltation. This was a near-sacred project undertaken with the utmost gravity. It usurped the God that wasn't. It did his works, but only those of 45,000 square meters or more. Modesty has no place when you're taking on the most vainglorious force that never was. The God that never was wasn't a micromanager, so why should his apes be? L'Unité d'Habitation in Marseille was not the first building that Le Corbusier had designed in reaction to his earlier idiom. He had made tentative forays, rather ham-fisted, left-handed, as early as the early 1930s. But L'Unité's size, ambition, fecund invention, outrageousness and sheer effrontery caused it to capture the imagination of architects the world over, in contrast, much bruited contrast, to the reaction of the people of Marseille. They are said to have referred to it as La Maison du Fada. Fada is a Provençal word which is not spoken with much fondness. It means madman. Specifically, a madman who is possessed, touched by extra-worldly powers, by contact with elves, no doubt. Who actually coined this epithet is not recorded. This was how the new was greeted, or rather, how we were told it was greeted. Here was a presage of the notorious gulf that would come to exist between the will of architects and the taste of, well, of who exactly? Concrete monstrosity. Defensive antagonism, blaming anything but their own prejudices, their own ignorance, their own incuriosity. Such was the behaviour of a vociferous, populist, moralistic, aesthetically timid faction that wanted to lead the world backwards. Their heirs, taxi drivers who write for newspapers, still want to bury their head in the sands of time, some other time, usually the 18th century. An obscure group calling itself the Society for French Aesthetics, which probably dreamed up the coinage La Maison du Fada, went so far as to bring a suit for damages against Le Corbusier. It lost. It was typical of those factions which claimed presumptuously to speak on behalf of the ordinary people, which invent slogans for the common man, which encourage hard-working families and other demographic fictions to militate against the unfamiliar simply because it is unfamiliar. Muslims undertake the Hajj to Mecca, where they may be crushed in stampedes. Gamblers hit Vegas and lose everything. Ailing Catholics visit Lourdes, and they don't get better. Hindus immerse themselves in the septic, shit-thickened Ganges at Varanasi. Architects go to Marseille, to l'Unité d'Habitation, an apartment block that is another place of pilgrimage. The danger here is more subtle. It is that l'Unité has, for 60 years, proved an invitation to plagiarism or homage, which are the same thing. In fact, no one plagiarized Le Corbusier so comprehensively as Le Corbusier himself. The 4 further unités are like full-scale models of the original. They lack the handmade, almost arts and crafts qualities that the architect brought to the original one, and brought also to his works in eastern France at Ronchamp, Firminy and La Tourette, to the Jaoul houses in Neuilly, and to his many works at Chandigarh. Prefabricated, that's to say factory-produced building systems of the same era, Clasp, Riemer and so on, evidently persisted with standardization. They achieved a worldwide monotony, block after featureless block built of the same panels, the same windows, and with the same paucity of imagination. Brutalist buildings, forged on-site from poured concrete, had the evident capacity for uniqueness, or at least to be different from each other, because they weren't reliant on prefabricated components. Some of the pilgrims who congregated at l'Unité randomly pilfered tics and mannerisms of the sculptural vocabulary, the plastic font that Le Corbusier had invented. They replicated this form or that when they got the chance, or misapplied brise-soleil in northern climes. But the overwhelming effects that this building had were those of inspiration and an unshackling of the imagination. It stretched the limits of the possible. It showed what could be done, and what was eventually as international as the international style, though less inhibited. But then art has always been international. The Gothic, the Columna, Van der Weyden and Boots in the north, Crivelli and Cosimo Torre in the south. Who took from whom? There was nothing new about mounting a building on pylons or pilotti. Le Corbusier himself had been at it since the 1920s, and his nameless predecessors for 6,000 years, certainly since the late Mesolithic period. Pylons or stilts keep at bay enemies, tides, floods, rodents, assorted predators. They are staples of coastal, estuarine and bucolic vernacular architecture. Chonquet at Arcachon, the granaries of Galicia, southern English barns raised on staddle stones, Hong Kong and Cambodian fisher cabins, Maghrebian beach houses, Carrelais on the Gironde, Mediterranean cabanons at such places as Gruisson-Plage. Mounting a building on such hefty legs was, however, unprecedented. They're the legs of a pachyderm. But what sort of pachyderm has 34 legs? It must be an insect, a Tragunta quatuorped. But even an insect with elephantiasis does not have legs this thick. Further, the pilotti form a nave, or a nave's ancestor, the sacred grove. It's all as exhilaratingly impure as an oxymoron, a centrifugal simultaneously pulling in several directions. It's what Max Ernst talked of his own work as being, a hallucinatory series of contradictory images, a series which refuses to be resolved into a single meaning. It's a multiple monument which defies explanation. When Jean Cocteau saw Nijinsky, he exclaimed, "What grace! What brutality!" That's the dancer, not the Derby winner. And indeed, as well as possessing a singular delicacy of movement and an exceptional gamut of expression, Nijinsky had the shoulders of a prop forward and the face of a manly woman. What grace, what brutality is the most fitting reaction to l'unité. It's self-contradictory, dissonant, contrapuntal. It was finished early in 1952. It had taken 6 years to build. Architecture is a slow business. It wasn't till it began to attract idolaters of a sort that anyone thought to look at bunkers and flak towers as architecture rather than as the defences of a vanquished regime. As a model for social housing, l'unité was often disastrous because it was so ineptly copied. The earliest of the thousands of schemes it spawned began to appear towards the end of the 50s. The copyists were copying the uncopyable. L'Unité is a one-off, a work of art as much as an apartment block. However, as a springboard to a new sort of architectural invention, it was peerless. It was a conduit. It sanctioned sculptural concrete, which had been off-limits, and it vastly increased the gamut of models that architecture might draw on. It changed architecture's attitude towards both the past and nature. Imagine a form of IVF which creates babies which are giants. Their pituitary gland is programmed to shrink the 12-foot-tall, 25-stone newborn monster throughout its childhood and adolescence till it achieves adult size. The brutalist mindset was enthused by such impossibilities, apparent impossibilities, by the lure of counterintuition, of going against nature. But then nature itself goes against nature. Nature overturns what is carelessly called the natural order. Inhabitants of sober landscapes and temperate climates are persuaded of nature's reticence and courtesy. Their experience is not that of those who live in more extreme latitudes, where the notion of equanimity is alien. Nature, in one man's manner, the everyday surroundings that he takes for granted, is another's exotic grail. There's no universalism in nature and little in man, but, as David Hume observed, there is a universal tendency among mankind to conceive of all beings like themselves, and to transfer to every object those qualities with which they are familiarly acquainted and of which they are intimately conscious. The sublime elements of nature that succoured brutalism were seldom to be found in Britain. They were then, in that last era before the advent of mass foreign travel, not those that the British were familiarly acquainted with: jagged rockscapes, repetitive basaltic organs, subterranean extravaganzas and geological gordies, weird trees, petrified forests. An architecture suggestive of such phenomena is bound to be more alien in Britain than it is in dramatically furnished countries, where the link between built forms and natural forms is more readily made. Inverted pyramids, elusive shapes, reckless cantilevers, toppling ziggurats, vertiginous theatre, imitations of pyrites, the defiance of gravity, always a sign that a demigod is at work. The architectural imagination was flying. Which was alarming to the timid aesthetic arbiters of a country which was zealously divesting itself of the relics of the last time that architects went on a collective bender. England was being architecturally cleansed of high Victorian works. Buildings of great grace and greater brutality were demolished at the rate of a dozen a week throughout the 1950s. They were, of course, monstrosities. Brutalism changed the way that architecture drew upon nature. Applied decorative representations, usually formal, occasionally naturalistic, of, say, bearded steroid junkies called atlants, of boughs, tendrils, fronds, bucrania, of vessel-bearing maidens called caryatids. All of these disappeared with international modernism. They didn't return. Brutalism, however, did not shun representation. Anything but. Instead, however, of just incorporating natural forms, its ambition was to create buildings which were themselves natural forms. Such a remaking of the planet was not a modest undertaking. It didn't copy what was already there. It invented natural forms, new natural forms. That's what art does. It makes what was not there before. It creates what was lacking. These new natural forms possessed manifold textures and surfaces. The precedents were, firstly, some of the 17th and 18th century's more extravagant exercises in rustication. But they too were applied rather than integral. Secondly, they derived from the camouflage craft. Bunkers were routinely given dense, irregular, impasted surfaces of random incisions and accretions in order to break up the shape of a building seen from the air. Texture was more important than colour, for all reconnaissance photography was still monochrome. The brutalists created the most haptic civilian architecture ever. Board-marked concrete grazed skin, furrowed concrete tore clothes, bush-hammered concrete just hurt. Here's an instance of the way in which they overbearingly demanded an audience and, having won that audience, treated it with unrepentant aggression. They never pandered. And they never forgot the belligerence that brutalism was born from. A building is a weapon. If they pleased, and they were indifferent to whether or not they did so, they pleased by choosing not to please, by respecting humankind as equals who were not to be spoken down to, not to be patronised, not to be treated like children. Remember, 50 years ago, adults did not dress like children. They did not try to read children's books. They did not enjoy children's diet. The more they've been consulted as consumers of anything, the more they've elected to be fed drivel, and the more they've regressed into irreversible infantilism and helpless dependency. Brutalism, like much of its era, was an encouragement to betterment. It was singularly optimistic. It was meliorist. Because architecture does not depend on language, its example is spatially and temporally limitless. It is, so to speak, portable. It crosses borders. Localism was once a necessity, available materials, lack of communications and so on. But localism today, neo-vernacular, built communitarianism, is a fake. Its architecture is a badge of identity and of exclusion, in the way that regional accents are.
Language.
Architecture does not have a language, despite the convenient shorthand which misuses the word language to describe its mute gestures, mute devices, mute beams, mute foundations, mute jetties, mute windows, mute lintels. It does not speak to us. It does not sign. Even so-called architecture parlante, the abattoir in the form of a donkey, the town hall in the form of a backhander, the parliament in the form of an asylum for the criminally insane, is doomed to repeat one word over and over again. Soi-disant architectural language is no more speakable than body language, which, again, isn't a language, although every thinker in the world is increasingly fluent in this unwitting semaphore.
Body language.
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 Body language. The all-important body language.
Because architecture is not a language, it requires no translation. We glance at architecture, we stare at it, we scrutinize it, we react to it. We may feel frightened, we may feel awestruck, we may feel powerless in the presence of vastness and blankness. But whatever properties we invest it with are the products of our sensibility, our reason, our wonder, our despisal. There is no compact with buildings. Our relationship with them is one-sided. It is not reciprocated. To think otherwise is delusory. Your inflatable rubber doll friend does not love you. It, not she, is unaroused by you. Frank Lloyd Wright, an architect almost as protean as Le Corbusier, was among those who took up the fashion for Mayan architecture, a fashion which peaked in California in the late 1920s. Though architecture may not be the way to describe it, it was rather a question of exterior decoration, of buildings sheathed in blocks incised with motifs that were Mayan or Mayan-ish, or Zapotec or sort of Aztec. This eclecticism was prompted by the dissemination of Mesoamerican archaeological research, which had begun in the 1880s. Here, then, were the New World's own primitives, save, of course, that they weren't that primitive, just less well-armed than Spaniards with God on their side. Still, no matter how unconvincing and slight these initial essays might have been, they were significant because they were the first instances of architects taking their cue from pre-Hispanic, pre-Columbian America. There is a significant difference between the approach to the past adopted by the post-Corbusier, post-Bunker generation and the imitative approach adopted by Frank Lloyd Wright and other Mayan revivalists such as the eccentric English-born architect Robert Stacey Judd. The pre-Columbian architecture to which the later generation was drawn was predominantly that of the Incas. Stern, massive, monumental, hardly decorated, cyclopean. Constructed in response to the harsh Andean climate, it was the elemental qualities of ancient architecture that the brutalists immersed themselves in, as if learning how to build from the beginning. They were finding their way back to rudiments. There was no question of mimicry, of reproducing decorative surfaces. Here was an aesthetic program which sought to rediscover the very essence of architecture, which aspired to start from scratch. Because it was conducted in public, it was a far more audacious program than that of the painters and sculptors of half a century before. Far riskier too. It has to be emphasized that the denigration of brutalism by the aesthetically myopic is almost entirely retrospective. These people habitually use the label to describe everything that was built in the long 60s. As I say, they're myopes. Such is their furious abhorrence of any architecture created since the days when television was powered by steam, they can't distinguish sculptural brutalism from systems building or from curtain walling. The world of half a century ago, the world that brutalism was built for, was far from hostile to it. It was keenly receptive, excited by newness, eager for change, maybe naively eager. But change was presumed to mean better. Architectural change was inhibited by the rationing of materials such as steel and by building licenses which were not removed till late 1954. Even after that date, there were still shortages of materials. The time span between a scheme's inception and its completion is more often to be measured in years than in months. The shape of the building boom of the 60s was being hatched in the 50s by young architects who had mostly fought in the war. Young is in quotes. A young architect is almost certainly at least 40 years old. There could be no greater incongruity than that of brutalism's complexity, earnest, sternness, danger and menace, and early pop music's sweet simplicity, fluffy immediacy and eagerness to please. They belonged to different eras which happened to exist at the same time. They inhabited parallel worlds. The people who made pop were mostly a generation junior. These two expressions of the late 50s and the 60s do not meet each other. The music of brutalism is musique concrète, Schoenberg, Berg, Miles Davis, Serialists and Stockhausen. Events do not adhere to calendrical chance. The 1960s London that is repetitively shown on telly comprises mini-skirts, mini-mokes, mods, hippies, King's roadies, dolly birds, LSD trips, addled mysticism, philosopher hairdressers, gingham, the pheasantry, Courage, Hung on You, a kaleidoscope of polychromatic vacuity and enjoyably witless hedonism. This was the exclusive London of David Bailey and perhaps 1,000 of his very closest friends. It was hardly characteristic of the experience of the other 7 or 8 million inhabitants. As is often the case, the atypical is presented as being the everyday. Even though pop music grew up in the middle 60s, there was still an absence of affiliation with the architecture. There was still a generation gap. Brutalism was mostly Dad's architecture. And it became, furthermore, the architecture of the establishment, of Harold Wilson's administration, of the new universities, of municipal libraries, of the state's theatres and galleries, of cultural welfarism and hospitals. Save for a vague correspondence between the blues craze of 1962 to 1964 and the architectural fascination with the primitive, governmentally sanctioned brutalism had only the frailest cultural links to popular music, clothes, and so on. What it did share was an insatiable appetite for turning over the old order, for novelty for its own sake maybe, but why not? Novelty did not then carry a pejorative implication. The forces of novelty pulled in countless conflicting directions. Nouvelle vague, nouvelle cuisine, new left, nouveau roman, new psychiatry. The therapeutic state is controlling you, bin your medication. New universities busily invented new disciplines. Vatican II decreed that new churches should be churches in the round, like theatres in the round. Every town was awarded a shopping mall, a bypass, and a series of underpasses where aspiring sex offenders could loiter and learn their trade. The future was almost upon us. It's just over there, mate. Tomorrow's transport would be powered by magnetic levitation. We would soon feed ourselves on a regime of capsules and pills, emigrate to space colonies, teach animals to speak, transfer thoughts, wear woggles, banish disease, never have to work because robots would do it for us, attain immortality in plastic bubbles. The heart that beats within us is made from Gore-Tex, and within that heart and within our mind is an unshakable belief in progress, which would beget further progress, which would beget further progress, and so on and on. It turned out to be anything but unshakable. Ken James, the scientist who introduced operational research and computing to the civil service, had lived through a mid-century dominated by 2 genocidal theocracies, Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany. He remarked that the last thing he expected to see late in his long lifetime was religion once again raising its ugly head. But that, of course, is what happened. The Ayatollah Khomeini, whom the squeamish Giscard and the ailing Shah had neglected to assassinate, revived theocratic rule. Whilst in the addled West there grew, from its beginnings as a late 1960s alternative backwater, a gloopy soup of mysticism, tree-hugging, whole-earthness, and the advent of the environmental piety which is today de rigueur. Small is beautiful, to which the apt reply is big is sublime. This process does not represent progress. Indeed, the very notion of progress is today widely discredited as a sort of hubris, a relic of when mankind in its vainglorious naivety held itself to be all-powerful, capable of ruling the world. At the high point of brutalism, I was in my teens. I shall never forget my excitement when walking across Hyde Park, I saw the Royal College of Art for the first time. And I shall never forget my amazement at the sheer virtuosity of the tricorn, almost finished, not yet inhabited. It was like concrete from outer space. You get to realise that you have lived through what to subsequent generations is history, second-hand, lied about, generalised, mediated, and only obliquely related to one's own experience of a far-off epoch whose mores and hopes and moods actually promised a better world, though we knew the promise was preposterous. The cretinous apes of the demolition community must salivate at the very thought of brutalism. Such juicy pickings. England's two finest brutalist schemes, designed by Rodney Gordon of the Owen Luder Partnership, the Trident at Gateshead and the Tricorn in Portsmouth, have both been destroyed. English heritage typically did not lift a finger to protest. You can imagine the kind of timid dross they've been replaced with. Pimlico School, gone. Basil Spencer's Hutchison Town Flats in Glasgow, gone. Long outlived by the ephemeral Rolling Stones, the ephemeral Roy Wood, the ephemeral Joe Brown, which only goes to show. Show what? Imperial College London got rid of its magnificent Hall of Residence. English heritage, well, you know the score. Cooling towers are sublime structures. They enhance the landscape. They especially enhance the landscape of the flatlands. They make the East Coast Main Line exciting. They create their own weather. Those at Richborough near Ramsgate, at Sheffield and at Retford have been wantonly demolished. Richard Green, an economist who is professor of something called sustainable energy in business at demolition-crazed Imperial College London, defends the destruction of cooling towers thus. You have to think, how much does this enhance the landscape compared to what else we could do if we weren't having to maintain the towers? This appears to be the very epitome of unreflective short-termism and a not particularly convincing justification for sanctioned vandalism. Would Professor Green propose building a science park at Stonehenge or dumping a housing estate on Malmesbury Rings in order to make these sites pay their way? Would he be in favour of defacing maiden castles' environs with a kitschy, twee, Germanic development and calling it Thomas Hardy Theme World? No, calling it Poundbury. The intrinsic value of a structure has nothing to do with how old it is. A menhir, whose age is measured in millennia, is not necessarily superior to plant whose age is measured in decades. There is, incidentally, nothing remotely sustainable about destroying the evidence of the recent industrial past, unless, that is, sustainable merely means a devotion to the bottom line. The appropriation by every exciting start-up and thrilling enterprise of the prefix sustainable would be comical, were it not so obviously mendacious. Sustainable street furniture, sustainable nail extensions, sustainable liposuction, sustainable logistics, sustainable root canals, sustainable bestiality, sustainable strategies, sustainable offal shampoo, sustainable masturbation. Open, transparent, sustainable, the three great lies of the age. Life itself is not sustainable. I'm going to die. You are going to die. Get over it. The sacred cow of sustainability is due for slaughter. It goes on and on and on. Aesthetic pygmies, officious functionaries, mediocrities with pompous job titles. Soon an entire architectural epoch will have been pulverized into extinction by legally sanctioned vandals. Why? A lack of appetite for sublimity, a fear of being afraid or overawed, a mistrust of might, a despisal of intellectual rigour, an impatience with anything which might be deemed difficult. These values abound in a Western culture which demands coziness, comfort, instant comprehensibility, pap, and populism's goodie bag. And the solaces of smallness of scale. Humans in the first world, the rich world, may have got physically larger, fatter, but the objects around them have been miniaturized. Fubsy hands grasp midget computers. Sausage fingers mishit Tony Me boards. We live in a micro world. We live too in an atomized world. There is every reason to be nostalgic for the Cold War. But why the structures that derive from that era should be deemed surplus to requirement and thus expendable is a different matter. Taste, crazes, the adherence to norms, fashion. Delirious high Victorian monuments were obliterated in the name of common sense and civilization, which was apparently at its height in the 18th century. What is it with the Georgians? Georgian, Barry Lyndon, Quality Street, the crescents, the minuets, the follies, the elegance, the stab me vitals, the dignity, the manners, the punctilios, the dentistry, the syphilis, the sewers, the rookeries, the halitosis, the lifespans, the malnutrition. Or ought I not to have mentioned these? What it is with the Georgians is the lack of threat. There's no animus. They're modest. They doff their caps. They give great forelock. They're apologetic. They say sorry. And they have fermented an architectural ethos which says sorry, in countless ways, in manifold styles, which cause the greatest offence by attempting not to give offence. The destruction of brutalist buildings is more than the destruction of a particular mode of architecture. It's like burning books. It's a form of censorship of the past, a discomforting past by the present. It's the revenge of a mediocre age on an age of epic grandeur. It's the cutting down to size of a culture which committed the cardinal sin of getting above its station, pushing God aside and challenging nature. It's the destruction, too, of the embarrassing evidence of a determined optimism that made us more potent than we have become. We don't measure up against those who took risks, who flew and plunged to find new ways of doing things, who were not scared to experiment, who lived lives of perpetual inquiry. Here was mankind at its mightiest. Brutalism has to go, for it's the built evidence of the fact that once upon a time we were not scared to address the earth in the knowledge that the earth would not respond, could not respond. Brutalism's grandeur taunts us. It reminds us that our supposed reciprocal compact with the earth is an illusion. The most powerful legacy of the age of brutalism is the legacy of the reaction against it. A reaction formed of an alliance of moralistic yogurt weavers, new left pietists and free market pirates. Hippie entrepreneurs were merely Manchester liberals in patchouli and velvet. Thatcherites avant la lettre. By the time this generation was middle-aged, its bullying sententiousness was established as the consensus from which only the perverse accepted themselves. It has trodden the green path to self-righteousness and big-heartedness. It cares for animals, it cares for trees. Boulders have rights. Every grain of the earth's sand possesses a raft of entitlements. Beware the child who picks a wild flower. The new Boney, Bono, will smother the little mite with humanitarian concern. Badger gassers, innocently going about their daily business, risk finding Brian May strumming some dreadful rock anthem to his stripy friends in their set. And the post-brutalist architecture of the past 40 years, which has accompanied this posture, has predominantly been commensurately pessimistic. the architecture of no confidence, the architecture of not standing out, the architecture of playing safe. Predominantly. The tiny proportion of stuff by big-name goats which is recurrently mediated, flatteringly photographed and slavishly written about is, as usual, far from typical. What is typical, always has been, always will be, is the work of the small-name sheep. Neo-vernacular, which is polite to the earth. Special needs postmodernism, in case the earth is a slow learner. Because, however, the earth is inanimate, it doesn't understand when it is being treated with respect or kindness or gentleness. It doesn't know it has friends. It is incapable of such comprehension. Its friends are cheerfully delusional. Poor saps might as well be raging wrists gaping at a porn star telling themselves, "She wants me." There's an entrenched category error here. Volcanoes and tsunamis are incapable of distinguishing between humans who build eco-chummy benders and humans who construct sculpturally magnificent knolls of brutalism. It's rather like expecting a bomb-planting jihadi to have the nous to distinguish between infidel victims who are fellow travellers of his half-witted cause and infidel victims who'd happily string him up. Soft building is made out of bad faith, out of a mendacious proposition. It is, of course, made by and for guilt-ridden humans. Apologising to the earth for our forebears' treatment of it is even more vacuous, even more wretchedly self-serving than apologising to the heirs of slaves, to the heirs of the exploited and the mass-murdered. Still, while my coevals have been luxuriating in a lifetime's cosseting penitence and cozying up to their pain and nursing their precious alienation, there has grown up a more hard-headed generation which understands the brutalist aesthetic, its social programme and urbanistic vitality, and which treats it with an appreciative enthusiasm. Now, half a century after its heyday, a wholesale rehabilitation of brutalism is underway. The knee-jerk deprecations of bien-pensant non-thinkers are being ridiculed by a new generation, mostly born after that heyday. The received ideas are being questioned. The aesthetic, the ethic, and the antagonism are being scrutinised. Michael Abrahamson, whose photo archive is called Fuck Yeah Brutalism. Louise Hayward, born 1963, makes prints of South London social housing. David Liaudet, born 1971, is an archivist of architectural postcards. David Heifer, born 1935, makes paintings of South London social housing. Frédéric Chaubin, born 1959, is a photographer of the Brezhnev and Kosygin play The Sands in Vegas School of Architecture in the former Soviet satellite states. Jan Kempenaars, born 1968, is a photographer of the monuments that Marshal Tito erected to preserve the memory of the National Liberation War, the war against Hitler. Nicolas Moulin, born 1970, is a photographer and collagist of ideal dystopias and immense lyrical grim morphoscapes. Neil Montier, born 1982, is a photographer and collagist of desolate landscapes infected by ruinous point blocks and viaducts. The sheer joylessness is thrilling. Baz Printzen, born 1975, is a photographer and collagist. Peter Makitic, born 1948, photographer of the Atlantic Wall. These artists are using brutalism as brutalists used rock formations and castle ruins. As I said, not all crazes, not all tastes, not all fashions, not even all religions are blatantly commercial creations. Some, the worthwhile minority, are born of a commonality, a harmonious unison, a thread of juncture, a complex combination of circumstance, coincidence, chance, and, no doubt, various other alliterative properties. A number of British writers, most notably Owen Hatherley, born 1981, and Douglas Murphy, born 1982, have disputed the received history of brutalist social housing, have questioned the unquestionable, the supposition that such housing was not welcomed by its tenants. It was welcomed. It was new, exciting, hygienic, light. There were inside toilets and central heating. It had yet to be gangrened by local authority mismanagement and neglect. You don't buy a car, then never get it serviced. The lifts had yet to be pissed in. The stairwells had yet to become crime scenes. It had yet to be used as a sort of asylum. That was the horrible future, which was by no means inevitable. These writers have displayed a nuanced nostalgia for a utopian grandeur which was far more realised than the media have subsequently been willing to admit. As I say, it is the bullying loudmouth twits of the political and journalistic classes who have done, and continue to do, most of the objecting. Whatever party or faction they belong to, they stick like glue to the accepted wisdom. Wisdom here means its very opposite, ignorance. They have another shock coming. We are witnessing the emergence of neo-brutalist architecture. It is not revivalist. It begins where first-generation brutalism finished. The timid piety of sustainability is being abandoned in favour of a more aggressive stance. Green architecture has been a failure, a spendthrift cosmetic exercise in environmental correctness and self-righteousness. Architects are once again considering themselves to be artists who lead, rather than meekly following as social workers, climate guardians, functionaries who do the bidding of the consensual bland mass. This signals a cultural shift, a move away from inoffensive accessibility, eager to please lowest common denominator architecture, towards what artists ought to do: please themselves, create the unknown and assert mankind's supremacy over the earth rather than cozy up to the inanimate. This revived brutalism is saying once again, you are the audience, we are the creators, no concessions. We're going to be getting an architecture as tough as that archetypal Cold War figure, the steroid-enhanced East German woman shot-putter fighting off the crinkle-necked security simian who's attempting to arrest her for shoplifting. An architecture which, in the words of Mr. Owen Luder,
doesn't have any reason to say sorry.
If you enjoyed this programme, visit the Post-War Architecture Collection on the BBC4 website, where over 20 architecture programmes from the BBC archive are available to view. And our brand new architecture series, The Brits Who Built the Modern World, concludes here on BBC4 at 9 on Thursday.